Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons, the new setting book, Guilds of Ravnica, the Magic the Gathering setting, and how the differences between Dungeons & Dragons, the source of magic for Dungeons & Dragons, and the source of magic for Magic the Gathering are so fundamentally different that they really can't coexist going forward as two active setting sources for Dungeons & Dragons. All right, so let's dig into it. All right. So specifically, Dungeons & Dragons' source of magic is bifurcated. It is the source of magic for Dungeons & Dragons is arcane magic, comes from the world, it comes from the universe. It's very generic, very open, very little real explanation of what it is, how it works, why it works. Virtually no explanation, actually. And then also there's divine magic, which is granted by deities, and really is in complete opposition in many ways to what is said about arcane magic. So I never really thought about this before in Dungeons & Dragons because there was never a direct competitor to take over the settings of Dungeons & Dragons as the active settings before Magic the Gathering showed up on the scene in 2018 with Guilds of Ravnica. But the more you think about the magic of Dungeons & Dragons, it makes very little sense. It really is not well crafted. Right, from the perspective of being consistent and making sense, right? Specifically from the source, okay? The source for Magic the Gathering is much, much stronger. It's not bifurcated. It doesn't come from deities and also come from the, from the universe, right? So that problem is solved within Magic the Gathering. And it has a really very distinct source, right? You know exactly where the magic comes from in Magic the Gathering. It comes from the land itself. It comes from islands, it comes from mountains, it comes from swamps, it comes from plains, and it comes from forests. And each one of those types of land provide a different type of magic to a planeswalker, okay? Which is far more powerful than a wizard in Dungeons & Dragons, okay? And in addition to that, when you look at Magic the Gathering for the source of magic and how magic functions, Dungeons & Dragons magic starts to break down even worse, okay? So with Magic the Gathering, the source, how magic works is much more fundamentally understood, and the timing for magic is much stronger, right? So within Magic the Gathering, when you cast a spell, the planeswalker has to draw from land. They have to draw magic from land to get it to function the way they want it to function, right? And they might need 2 forests and 3 other sources of mana, and that can come from any land color, okay? So there is colored land, right? Colored land magic, colored mana that is coming from a specific source, whether that source is island or forest. And then the rest of the mana for a spell can come from any land, right? And that's uncolored mana, right? And this is all very, very mechanically based within Magic the Gathering, right? Also, when a planeswalker casts a spell, right, another planeswalker has the ability to instantly say, no, we're gonna I'm gonna counter that spell and able to stop the spell immediately, right? In addition to that, Magic the Gathering magic has planeswalker casts a spell, another planeswalker casts a spell, another planeswalker casts a spell. These all go on a stack of spells and they resolve in a specific order, right? How magic functions within Magic the Gathering is so much more intricately and ornately crafted than what is seen within Dungeons & Dragons. They're not even close, right? The structure of magic within Magic the Gathering absolutely crushes anything ever presented within Dungeons & Dragons. They're not even remotely close, right? And so here's the thing. Now that Guilds of Ravnica exists within Dungeons & Dragons, just like happened with Dungeons & Dragons, like any topic, right? If you pick right now, there's a guy on Twitter who's writing articles about one character in the Yawning Portal, And the article is like literally 3,000 words long, right? Once you introduce something within Dungeons & Dragons, dungeon masters, players are going to delve into it. And it's not going to take long at all for dungeon masters to see the magic within Magic the Gathering works in a fundamentally different way than the magic in every other Dungeons & Dragons setting. And on this side, on the magic side, it's consistent, it's not bifurcated, there's a structure for it, and all of this can be D&Dized, right? We can take this, put it into our D&D games, and we can build stories on it. But we can't build stories on characters that are coming from Forgotten Realms with a complete, very weak magic structure, very weak magic sources, right? And mix that with what's happening in Magic the Gathering, because they're not even remotely the same, and their level of scale and their level of construction are vastly different, right? So it looks shoddy if they're mixed, right? So going forward, I really think, and the issue is, there's so many commercial reasons to make Magic the Gathering the settings for Dungeons & Dragons going forward that I really think you can't have both. And also the company has already learned its lessons from the 90s when it had so many different settings and it was trying to build everything, right? That the idea of Dungeons & Dragons going forward and saying, okay, well, we just gave you that Magic the Gathering book, right? And that's an entire universe that is left unexplored. But we're going to go back and give you another adventure book based on, based on the merest shreds of Forgotten Realms that we've barely sketched for you in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It's very clear. I really think going forward, it's going to be the Magic the Gathering settings. And the other thing is, I'm really curious what's going to happen with Guilds of Ravnica as far as sales. And more than ever, we really have this issue here too, where the sales of Magic the Gathering, the sales of Dungeons & Dragons, I'm not sure they matter. I'm not sure they matter at all, the sales of the books. And the reason, and this is very, very, very important to understand, okay? Magic the Gathering is Dungeons & Dragons is a multi-billion-dollar IP in disguise. Right now, it makes very little money on the books that it actually prints, right? The entire industry, the entire tabletop role-playing industry is all books combined every year is approximated by ICV2 to be about $35 million a year, which is chump change for almost any industry, right? But here's the kicker, right? It doesn't matter how much money Dungeons & Dragons makes with print product. And the reason why is it's Americana, and its name is worth a fortune. And there's always this possibility of the film, which could make billions and make Dungeons & Dragons a household name overnight and restore the 80s and the 90s and actually well surpass the 80s and the 90s, right? So that's the key is Dungeons & Dragons, the game, the print book is a talisman. In my opinion, it'll never stop being printed. And the reason why is there's so much possibility. If there's a series of films, right, you could be looking at the creation of a Marvel level, essentially a Marvel level intellectual property and film series, right? And that is huge. That is really, really big, right? So Dungeons & Dragons has fundamental value within its own body, right? But this idea of where the settings come from, it's a whole other issue, right? Where a whole other issue. Sorry, I hate when I say whole another. Sorry. So it's really critical to understand that it doesn't really matter how many books are sold for Guilds of Ravnica, right? Really, Dungeons & Dragons is just one brand sitting within Hasbro, but it has incredible potential, and it has a history like no other history with it for almost any of the brands within that's held by Hasbro, right? It's incredibly, its potential is high, right? It's like this talisman that just contains all this magic. You don't smash that talisman. You keep that talisman intact. even if it isn't making a ton of money for you, because it has the potential to make a huge amount of money, and it continues to produce money, right? It is absolute. Dungeons & Dragons is without a doubt the most profitable tabletop role-playing game on the planet. It is very arguable that Dungeons & Dragons is more profitable than every other tabletop role-playing game in existence combined, right? So it is profitable now, but it hasn't even remotely reached its potential. So overall, the structure of Magic behind Magic the Gathering, the depth of those settings within Magic the Gathering, 25 years of multiple settings, each setting having hundreds of illustrations ready to roll, right? You can build a setting book in half the time at one quarter the cost, right? It's incredible how much of a commercial benefit there is to moving the Dungeons & Dragons settings to Guilds of Ravnica. The ramifications of Ravnica are absolutely immense, right? But I'm really convinced going forward it would look shoddy and silly for Dungeons & Dragons, for Wizards of the Coast to say, hey, here's your Magic the Gathering book. Here's your Magic the Gathering D&D setting book, and here's your Faerun adventure with the merest sketches of a setting that we've never presented to any of these new players with any setting book ever, right? This is a rock solid lock. I think the Dungeons & Dragons settings are finished. Magic the Gathering will be the official setting for Dungeons & Dragons, at least in my opinion, for the remainder of 5th edition and probably for 6th edition, and the ramifications of that, the ramifications of Magic changing from this bifurcated arcane power coming from the universe, divine power coming from deities, switching over to all magic comes from islands, forests, plains, swamps, mountains, and we know the timing of how a spell is cast. We know exactly how much mana is required for each spell. The idea of spells. I didn't even think about this, right? Like, okay, just to put this in perspective, these cannot coexist, right? So how many Dungeons and Dragons magic items are there, right? Within Dungeons and Dragons, you can take all that third-party nonsense and throw it out, right? Nobody cares about it, right? When you talk about Dungeons and Dragons magic items that have come through 1E, 2E, 3E, 4E, and 5E, and what's in 5th edition right now, right? Let's just stick with Dungeons and Dragons. Every magic item, right, and every spell. Let's talk about those two right there, right? You have how many spells? Maybe 500 spells, maybe 600, right? And your magic items, your official Dungeons & Dragons magic items, same thing, maybe 500, maybe 1,000, right? You know how many artifacts exist within Magic the Gathering, right? You know how many spells exist within Magic the Gathering? Right now, Magic the Gathering is approaching 40,000 cards. 40,000 cards, right? There are thousands of characters. There are thousands of magic items. There are thousands of spells. The world building that has been done in Magic the Gathering dwarfs what's been done in Dungeons & Dragons setting wise. So at factors, right? There's probably 10 times more spells existent within Magic the Gathering. 10 times more magical items existent within Magic the Gathering. 10 times more characters existent within Magic the Gathering. And even the scale of who knows who, right? Jace Blauron is known worldwide, right? Who knows Dritz Do'Urden? In 25 years, some of the Magic the Gathering characters have surpassed the characters that were established that are established in Dungeons and Dragons for Raceland. I am a dyed-in-the-wool Dungeons and Dragons fan. I love Dungeons and Dragons. I can barely remember who and what Raceland was, right? The reality is, when it comes to setting, Dungeons and Dragons never actually hit its stride. It never produced anything that broke away and created a strong, independent fantasy setting that was independent from what Tolkien had built, right? From a rules perspective, Dungeons and Dragons did something that no other tabletop game had ever done in the history of humankind. But setting-wise, it just never hit its stride. And so now that Magic just shows up on the scene with 25 years of illustrative world building built through art, right? World building that was fundamentally tied to mechanics, magic mechanics, from the beginning, right? I really feel that Guilds of Ravnica showing up as a setting, Magic the Gathering setting showing up to compete with Dungeons & Dragons setting, it is like LeBron James showing up at a high school basketball game. It's just like the D&D settings can't even remotely compete. Not even remotely. The ramifications of Ravnica are absolutely massive. I think the printing of the Guilds of Ravnica book could be one of the most important books printed within Dungeons & Dragons since the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition book, which opened up to OGL. The OGL was huge. It really did a lot for tabletop role-playing games overall. It's a historically important book. But I think Guilds of Ravnica could change Magic fundamentally for 20, 30 years. It really could. It's a huge, huge occurrence. Pay close attention to how the existence of the Guilds of Ravnica book impacts Dungeons & Dragons. It's massive. That's what I got. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. Please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you.